This is the AMP Business Podcast, a weekly show featuring the top leaders, innovators, and hustlers that are making it happen in Northern California. Here's your host, Chad Alderson.
Hey, welcome to another Season 1 episode of Homelessness in Chico. I'm your host, Chad Alderson. With us today is Patrick Newman. Patrick, you're with the Chico Friends on the Street. Is that correct? Is that how I say it?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Chad.
Of course, man.
Chico Friends on the Street is the name of our organization. Yep.
Cool. Well, can you talk about the charter a little bit? Like, what's the goal for the organization?
Sure. Chico Friends on the Street is a human rights advocacy group, advocating on behalf of people who are actually literally on the streets at night. We're not focused on housing issues, although they overlap with what we do in many ways. But the focus is on, whether people on the streets are criminalized, deprived of the things that they need, whether they're demonized as a population, and then ultimately whether they're contained or brought under some kind of incarceration model ultimately. So those kinds of things are things that we all look at. Okay.
We've had a couple meetings now to kind of prep for this and figure out what the format of the show was going to be and what the message was that you were going to get across. Or that you'd like to get across. First thing, I think just some foundational knowledge for folks. Housing First has come up in this series so far, Season 1, but we haven't really delved deeply into why that's important and what sort of tool set is provided if you do have a Housing First program. So can we first talk about like what it is and then the rationale for why it's a good thing?
So the way I look at Housing First from the perspective of our mission is that it's the one honorable solution that I see. So what is Housing First? It's pretty simple. You provide affordable housing units to people who need them, and that oftentimes tends to be a population with a broad array of disabilities and then just desperately poor people. And then you provide social services so that people who have access to that housing can be successful in remaining housed. And those are basically the two pillars of the Housing First model. The reason that that's relevant for me is that when I look at the landscape, I see Housing First as a solution. I see it being possibly implemented in any sort of comprehensive way somewhere in the remote future, but no time soon because the resources aren't being devoted to it. So that leaves us with what I call the failure zone, which is the zone in which there are many chronically homeless, unhoused homeless, meaning they're not even in shelters, chronically homeless people on the streets. And then that leads to the whole question of, do they have interests? Do they have civil liberties? Do they have human rights? And are those worth trying to understand as we look at the day-to-day life of those people and then how those people interact or interface with the community? And there's a lot of tension around that.
We were talking about strategic management versus just reactionary management. And if you look at Housing First as a program, what silo does that fit into, or what category would that fit into in your mind?
Well, silo in terms of different approaches to homelessness?
Strategic versus tactical reactions, like we were talking about earlier.
Well, I see it. I mean, when you have a solution, there's a strategy in implementing that solution, but when you actually have a solution that works and you know that it's going to work and you know that you can implement it, then it's not so much a strategic decision anymore. It's a question of, do you have the public will to implement the thing? Where we get into the weeds and the swamp and the confusion is when we don't solve the problem. And then there's a whole array of problems that come out of that. I heard you in an earlier podcast talking about your experiences in the waterways and how, you first noticed it. So all of a sudden, when the problem isn't dealt with, a bunch of consequences spill out from that. And that's what we have today. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question about silos, but I might not quite understand it right.
Well, I'm probably doing a bad job of articulating it. Like there's strategic things that we do, and then there's tactical things that we do, but they're driven by the strategies, right? Housing first is an overall strategy. The strategy to put homeless in temporary housing for as long as it takes them and the service providers around them to build, say, an ecosystem of trust, if you will, and to eventually get them to be self-actualized again. Is strategically is housing is that why it's important? Is it creating kind of like some sense of permanency or security in an otherwise kind of, day-to-day kind of an existence?
Well, I would probably put that a little differently. I think that there is a segment of the population that you're not just stabilizing, you're actually providing permanent housing for this segment of the population. So you have
so it's permanent in some cases?
Oh yeah, I would say in many cases, because most of the chronically homeless are disabled in some way or another.
I got you.
So you have, there was a study out of Toronto where over 40% of the men that they pulled off the streets of Toronto put in an MRI machine, they had traumatic brain injuries. So, about 85% of those incurred those injuries before they were homeless. So that's just a small study, but when you interact with the homeless population much, you can tell that a large number of people on the streets have brain injuries. It's really common.
We actually interviewed a guy for my fly fishing podcast who actually designed that vise that's sitting over there to tie flies. Mm-hmm. He had TBI and they didn't know it for many years, and his life almost fell apart because of it. He was able to right himself largely due to his wife that he married, and she did some research and they figured it out and got proper treatment. But
right.
There's a lot of people that just can't pull out of that nosedive, and those are the ones that probably end up on the street, I assume.
So when you talk about brain injuries, obviously you're talking about a wide spectrum of different, organic issues. So, there's cases where a brain injury is manageable, and then you have the resources, oftentimes a family that'll put a net under you. But parenthetically, this happens a lot with young men. So there's a large number of young men who are injured in military, construction accidents, car accidents, motorcycle accidents.
Fights in this guy's case.
Yeah, fights. And that's why I think the population is so high of men with that affliction. But so if it's a manageable injury and you have the resources, you can get a better result like the one you just described. If it's a more difficult to manage kind of injury and you don't have the resources, people fall through the cracks. And this is where this whole question, coming back to what you just said about, like, what's the long range goal of a Housing First program? Well, it's to house people and support them to whatever extent they need to henceforth. So if a person has schizophrenia, bipolar, massive childhood trauma, which is true with kids who come out of 20 or 30 foster homes. Again, brain injuries. There's a whole raft of things. Addiction, alcoholism, until the Clinton administration was actually classified as a disability. Most people don't know that. In the Welfare Reform Acts, they took it out. You used to be able to get disability for that. I personally see that as a medical disability issue. So in any population, there's going to be a percentage of people. In the most obvious, tangible form, when we see somebody, a quadriplegic, we can immediately identify that person as someone who's going to need support from their society in order to function. And so there's a percentage of people that the rest of us, you might say, need to support or even carry, if you want to use that word. And then the question becomes, how well do we do it? And so an advanced, humane society does it better. A society that drops its obligations to that population does it poorly. So, if just one more second on that subject, if you go back to the 1960s and you look at what are called the Lanternman Acts in the state of California, that was the time in our history when we deinstitutionalized a lot of the care that was being rendered across the board. There was people all the way from during the 1950s, they put homosexuals in mental institutions, but we also had alcoholics, drug addicts, and then people with developmental disabilities. You have people with brain injuries. You have the whole raft of mental illnesses.
But the point being, there was some sort of a federal.
Well, there was a state and federal institutionalized structure there.
Yeah.
And so, along with other civil liberties, initiatives of that time, race and sexual, gender-oriented civil liberties, we were looking at all kinds of people in society and saying who's marginalized, who's not, who's being discriminated against, essentially. And that group of people was seen as a group of people that were marginalized and discriminated against. So what was the solution? The solution was to deinstitutionalize that population. And then the notion was that those people would then be brought into our communities and given least restrictive lives. So, least restrictive environments. So that means that the person with a developmental disability can come and live in a group home, work in a sheltered workshop, participate in community life, rather than being housed in a mental hospital, which is what happened when I was a kid. I mean, I visited mental hospitals when I was a kid on sort of on a Christian basis or whatever, to do charity work or whatever, and you'd see a bunch of people in there that are now living in our communities. Well, when it came to developmental disabilities, we set up a whole network in California called the Regional Center System, and we did a pretty good job with that population, but we've done an absolutely poor job with the rest of the populations that were once institutionalized. And so the resources that we need for dealing with the needs of, say, a person with schizophrenia today, very poor. And when you have a housing shortage, you have a hybrid problem, because there's a housing crisis. There isn't enough affordable housing. There isn't enough mental health services. So that all comes together, and these people end up being bumped onto the streets, wandering around. Now, just to finish that up, the worst possible thing you can do with someone who has a mental illness is to put them on the streets, because now they're sleep deprived. Their lives are stressful. You talk about the way the community sees them. Well, what they experience on a day-to-day basis is horrific. So,
yeah, and they're
compounds the problem.
They're also fundamentally being pushed down the Maslow's hierarchy of needs instead of up.
Yeah.
So when you become more and more reactionary, and even to get a job takes some strategic planning to get that job. And if you're at the baseline thing where you're just trying to eat, then all other priorities are rescinded, so to speak, right?
And these are the least employable people to begin with. So then you're exactly right. You're making someone who's least employable in terms of competitiveness in the marketplace even less effective by virtue of the fact that their lives on the streets.
And Joy also described almost like this regression that happens mentally when you're living, day to day like this, very reactionary as opposed to strategic lifestyle planning.
True, but there's a trap that people fall into there, which I just want to mention real quickly, and that is that tends to be this notion, because people like to look at things hopefully, that if you just get people off the streets and give them this training, you can get them up to speed and they'll become one of us and they'll be able to get a job and go out there and get private sector housing and all that kind of stuff. We love those kind of stories. But the problem is that there's a large percentage of people wandering our streets right now who are not, I don't want to shortchange anybody, but I worked with developmentally disabled adults for 10 years, and I recognize disability as a real thing. So we have to look at this population and say, yeah, we can have those success stories, but ultimately there's a large number of those people that simply need a lot of support and always will.
When you say a lot of support, are you implying some sort of permanent housing with, I don't know what the right word is here, because it's not just even a small tiny home that they can have forever is not going to solve it. It's got to be like some other services wrapped around it, right? Because you can't just throw them in a tiny home and assume that they're going to be okay.
Yeah, there has to be a shelter, first of all, some kind of, and I really believe in, independent private spaces for people, because I think people that are unstable do best with those, versus putting a bunch of people into a home together, or a shelter where it's high density. But so the ideal is, yes, you have let's just say a 200 square foot studio apartment, with a tiny kitchenette and a bath, or maybe a single residency occupancy type situation where you have a room with a bath and then a kitchen down the hall or whatever. And there's lots of ways to do this where there's minimal square footage, but you have a shelter. And then you have to bring whatever social services are appropriate to bear in that situation. So there you have to do assessments. And it's like when I work with developmentally disabled adults, we would assess them, and we would look at what we thought their potential for independent living was, and then we would find a house, some kind of shelter for them, an apartment or something, move them into it, and then you write a program plan, what your goals are, how you're going to succeed in helping them succeed, and then you implement that plan. So we would need to do that for this population. And my impression of this population, after having gotten to know a lot of them over 6 years, is that the vast majority of them would respond very well to that kind of program, which is what Lloyd Pendleton found when he did Housing First. They picked the most difficult people first, and they found that they were very successful with them.
This is in Utah?
Yeah. He's kind of the Housing First guru.
Yeah. So I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a minute. The argument is that if you build out all these services, especially as robust as you're laying out, that it's you build it and they will come kind of argument, right? And I think there's a lot of truth to that, especially in our current state of, there's certain counties that just don't provide any services. And I'll give you an example. In the East Bay, I think I've talked about this before on the show. In the East Bay, I've got a couple buddies that are cops, and I drive around and I see hardly any homeless. And I'm like, I call my buddy and I'm like, why are there no home? Like, if I go just right over the hill, there's homeless everywhere. If I'm down in LA, I see homeless everywhere. Yeah. I drive through your guys' town. I go right up the gut of the town there in the business district, and there's not a single homeless person. And he said, yeah, it's pretty simple. We don't provide any services. So they just go to other counties that do. And if you've got, so as I've described it to you, I think before we hit record, if you've got these soft pockets of services where there's just no service, there's very little or no service, a homeless person's naturally going to be drawn like a magnet to the counties that actually have it. So when I hear, people talking about putting all this apparatus in place, that's the first thing that comes to mind as a counterpoint, because it's like this has to happen across all counties simultaneously to kind of, to share the burden, so to speak, not only just from the community perspective, but also just fiscally, that's the challenge right now. And I've kind of slowly been building this opinion up over you're my 6th interview, by the way, and probably 10th, 12th hour of interviews. And if you've listened to every one of them, thank you. But, what I'm coming to the conclusion is that this has to be, mandated and funded at the federal level and implemented obviously at the state and county level. But it's got to be like everybody's got to be into this. And, any biological system, I don't care what it is, has a certain part of that population that's always going to have issues. And in nature, natural selection solves that problem on its own. But because we have, we're conscious human beings, we don't have the luxury of just letting it, go to natural selection. And it seems like in a lot of cases, that's kind of how things are being managed right now. And it's fucking crazy. Yeah. Right.
Well,
so
I absolutely,
very reactionary.
I absolutely agree that.
But back to the, build it as, or the,
yeah, that's
where
where I'm going. I absolutely agree with you that this cannot be solved piecemeal, county by county, city by city. I think the only realistic way to solve this problem is to, we're getting very good at gathering data. It seems like we gather data.
Every year we're getting better.
Much better than we solve problems.
Which is good.
Well, it's good, but the application of data, not so good. But anyway, so we're really good at that. So we can figure out, we could prorate across every county in the United States based on, demographic information, what level of need there is to deal with people who have either disabilities or in extreme poverty for some reason to the point where they're not housed. You throw into that mix the question of how much housing is available in that area, how much of a deficit there is in terms of affordable housing, and you go in county by county and you mandate that the housing get built, and you mandate that the social services be provided, and that would best come at the federal level, and it wouldn't be very expensive relative to the rest of the federal spending we do. This is what's maddening about it. It's not a lot of money to do this.
And also, I don't personally look at it as a political issue. I think it's a policy thing.
Right, but it's very much political because that kind of policy,
big time.
Well, it's politicized because that kind of policy is just not very likely to come from the more conservative end of the spectrum. It's just not going to. That's not the agenda that they pursue typically. That's the kind of agenda that would be pursued by a more progressive, socialist-oriented kind of government. So, and you see it in the countries that have these programs. They tend to be countries that are more invested in social welfare. That is a political issue, and because of the politics of it, it affects policy. And so that takes laws that have to be passed in Washington.
I've got, because I've lived everywhere, literally everywhere in California, up and down the coast and everywhere, I've got friends that are, extreme right, extreme left. And I've got a lot of friends that are just right of middle or left of middle. And they're, most of them, if we, they talk about homelessness, it's either we need to take care of all these people and there's this kind of like motherly feeling, or it's I agree that we need to take care of these people, but it needs to be shared equally, and there's more of a fiscal kind of a perspective on it, and so it's grounded in how are we going to pay for it kind of a situation, and it's also I don't want to be the only one paying for it if it's going to happen. So I think that the way that news is distributed actually just only shows the two ends of the spectrum, the two extreme ends, because that's how they sell ads. But I really feel like, just down the middle and off both sides just a bit, that's where most people are politically. I really do believe that in my heart. And I think because they portray themselves differently on Facebook versus if you get them in front of you and and actually sit down and actually have a discussion. So I still have a little faith in humanity that way. It's a really interesting thing what's going on right now. And I just don't think that this particular thing should be politicized and it's being weaponized. It
shouldn't be, but social welfare is always a political issue. So when you go back to like the war on poverty, or you go back to the New Deal in the Roosevelt administration, those efforts were fought tooth and nail by people on I'll just say the conservative end of the political spectrum. And so those programs, including Social Security, the Social Security program was fought tooth and nail. So the history is that when you want to make progress on these kinds of issues, which are really wealth distribution issues, it's like, yes, we should all pay for it. Do you want to live in a society where, the most vulnerable, least competitive people have a decent life? Are you willing to pay some money to do that? Are you willing to tax the people who can pay the most to do it?
Yeah.
Those are political questions that, if you look at political candidates and how many of them ever mention the question of homelessness, it's very rare. And we would have to up our game in terms of social services in this nation in order to do a better job. And that's going to cost money. But like I said, relative to something like the Pentagon budget, we're probably talking about 1% of the Pentagon budget. We're talking about a few $1 billion to get all these people off the street, but it's totally possible and it's totally affordable. I just read today that this year people will spend $500 million on costumes for their pets, for Halloween. $500 million. When you put what it would cost to get, say 500,000 chronically homeless people in the United States plus, say 1 million off the streets, it's a maddeningly small number. And the fact that we're not doing it, and for the foreseeable future, as far as I can tell, will not do it, it drives me crazy. But this is not where I dwell. I don't dwell on that issue so much as I dwell on the question of, okay, the problem's not being solved. though, we agree it should be solved at the federal level, and it should be done. It should have been done 10, 20, 30 years ago. But in the meantime, there's all these people on the streets, and then there's a lot of questions about how those people on the streets are going to be treated. Like what kind of human rights are they going to have? What kind of civil liberties are they going to have? What kind of daily experience are they going to have?
Yeah, so, and I think like your average citizen that's walking around in Chico, they thinking about it in terms of what it's going to cost them personally, a feeling of safety, whether or not they have that, and there's a third one. I can't think of it now. Well, I was trying to segue gracefully into the concept of safety, but we'll just brute force.
I think we're right there.
Yeah,
I think we're right there.
So we were talking about safety as a concept, and it being a very much a relative kind of a thing, right? Where I'm 6'3", I'm 265 pounds. I'm probably more like 275, but I'll just say I'm 265. When I walk
I'll
around
shave
downtown,
off a few pounds on my way too, if you don't mind.
Yeah, when I walk around downtown, I don't get any kind of feelings of not being safe when I walk by somebody that's homeless. But if I'm 5'2" and 118 pounds and I've got a child in a stroller and my 3-year-old in tow and I'm pushing my stroller down the sidewalk and I'm going by a homeless guy that's, he's just raving and ranting on the side of the street, I'm probably not feeling safe. Not only personally for me, but more importantly for my 2 kids that are in tow. Now, physically, I don't feel like there's a threat there, but I also have been exposed to that kind of behavior living in Santa Monica, right? It's just like every time you go down 3rd Street Promenade, you get desensitized and normalized to that sort of behavior, and you realize it's actually not really that big of a threat. But if you're a mother with 2 kids, a feeling of safety or lack of safety is like a 10 for her, and it's like a 1 for me. So when we're talking about these interactions with the community and the homeless population through that lens, and there's the population density is like downtown for the most part, where those interactions are happening on a I would say a high frequency basis to drive public perception, and whether it's negative or positive, most of that interaction's happening down there. That's kind of like, I'm thinking of it from a brand perspective. When we were talking about this earlier, with all the different, the different service providers that are in town, and we have like the downtown city. Is it the City Plaza?
Yeah.
And then you guys do your food distributions at the City Plaza,
right?
And I'm wondering, is that really the best place to do this because of all these issues I just laid out? And from a brand perspective, if we're trying to get the community behind these programs, and you're putting the mom in this kind of a position, then it kind of goes again. It's kind of counterproductive in my mind. And why the City Plaza to do the food distributions? And 2, have you talked about maybe trying different locations, and also 3, do you feel any kind of, is what I'm saying about this whole brand perception and maybe doing some, kind of diluting the other service providers' ability to reach, people that for people to get behind these other service providers? Do you feel like you're diluting their I don't know, goodwill in the community, so to speak? Does that all make sense?
Yes. Good,
okay.
Good questions. You got about 3 or 4 of them there. So,
okay.
First of all, I'll just take them in order.
Yeah.
What I say to people who feel unsafe around the homeless population is make 100 sandwiches, go out with your stroller, whatever, and begin to interact. Hand out the sandwiches, get to know the population. There are people, mothers, who have come to the plaza during our feeding with their kids, and it's actually a joyful experience for them. Oftentimes what we fear because we don't know it very well, and it looks scary to us. But if you're looking at some kind of empirical basis for the fear, in other words, evidence in terms of, crime or statistics or whatever, mothers with strollers are not being attacked by homeless people. So they may see someone ranting, and people do have episodes on the street. They have absolute total mental health breakdowns right out in public. So because we've absolutely failed to address those people's needs, a lot of them end up in jail, which is now our mental hospital. I mean, this has been true for 30 years now. That's where mentally ill people go now. They go to jail. So we don't have mental health services for them. So what typically happens is they end up in some kind of, psychotic breakdown. They assault an officer or something, and then they're charged, as would anybody else be, with a felony, and they end up being locked up for long periods of time and go through this whole process of whether they're competent to stand trial. So point is, it's an absolute fact that we're warehousing a lot of our mental ill in our county prison system, actually, county jails. So the mother who may already have some antipathy toward the homeless and find them disgusting and resent their presence, I've seen this on social media. I saw this at the intersection of such and such and such and such. Somebody was running around the street with no shirt on, screaming, blah, blah, blah. So that's a great, what I call demonization story. So you can replay that over and over again, and people, there's a market for that narrative, and it ramps up that drama. It ramps up that feeling of, being unsafe. And there's a whole culture around that. Well, I don't know. As you say, we could talk about whether or not we're, physical strength has something to do with how safe we feel. But I know a lot of women who are, weigh half of what I do, that are perfectly comfortable working with and around the homeless population in and out of public spaces. So there's definitely a psychological element to this. I tend to think safety is very much in the eye of the beholder, and I think it has to be. I think some of that fear has to be challenged in ways that break that fear down rather than feeding it or amplifying it.
Yeah.
The reason we do what we do in the Plaza, there's a history to it, which I'll talk about for just a second. Back in 2013, there was a group called the Orchard Church that was feeding people every Sunday afternoon on the Plaza. To my mind, I just sort of watched it at a distance. I wasn't involved at that point with this population. I'm not religious, but I really liked what they were doing. I thought it was beautiful. They brought food. It was on the same corner that we go to every Sunday now, and they were feeding people and loving people and interacting and treating people with respect. And I thought it did nothing but help socialize people, make them feel less resentful of their position in the community, et cetera. Well, that program was confronted and essentially driven off the Plaza. I won't go into all the details of how that happened, but it was done at the city level. And when it was pushed off the Plaza, there was a compromise deal made where they were allowed to remain downtown, but they had to go behind the municipal building over on the east side of the municipal building and serve their meal there. To this day, that's where they do it. They serve a meal every Sunday evening behind the municipal building, where you really can't see them at all from the street. You have to go out of your way to see where they are. And it was deliberately done to hide that activity. Well, a lot of people thought, well, that's a really great compromise. How wonderful. And my response to that, and I wrote a lot about it. I wrote a cover story for the News and Review and lots of op-ed stuff about it at the time, was that's absolutely horrific. To me, that was the equivalent of saying, well, black people shouldn't complain about having to go sit at the back of the bus because they're still getting a ride. And that's what people said. Well, they're still getting fed. And my position on that was, well, no other class of people would be treated that way. If you're talking about women, blacks, LGBTQ, whatever, no other class of people in the United States would accept that kind of treatment where they say, well, you're getting your needs met, but you have to do it somewhere where you're hidden. So that really is what got me involved in this issue, was the fact that I thought that the symbolism of that was really pretty horrible. And I saw it as a human rights violation, and I still do. And so that's 6 years ago. When we meet on Sundays, we still meet on that same corner, and that corner where the Orchard Church was removed has a lot of symbolic importance. But beyond that history, the reason we do that in public in that space is to send a message that we see a population that must by necessity live in the public space now. They cannot live anywhere else. They have nowhere else to go. So if they're living in the public space, then we as a community, if this is what we've allowed to happen, then we should as a community affirm them in that space. We ought to stop criminalizing them in that space. We ought to provide restrooms in that space. And so it's an act of solidarity. So we bring a lot of material to the plaza, a lot of clothing, a lot of toiletries, a lot of tarps and raincoats and sleeping bags and all kinds of stuff like that. But the bigger message here is not a message of charity. It's a message of social justice, and it has to do with whether or not those people have a constitutional right to be in our public spaces. And there's people who don't think they do. And I think that's really dangerous, because those constitutional rights that they have as citizens, if you start taking theirs away, we're next. So yeah, there's a lot to why we do it there.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's just talk about like maybe the repercussions of doing that. Not
Sure.
only from, there's the downtown shop owner that's got that has a business downtown. He very likely, if that, I just want to stick with the stroller lady. If she had a bad experience, then she's less likely to go downtown. That's, from that shop owner's perspective, that's economically not beneficial. For that activity is not beneficial. And, and if, in terms of risk mitigation, how do you deal with that? So you would take some of your funding, or if you're part of a business association, that's going to be something that you try and, put some actions in place to maybe, kind of trying to tamp this down. So that money and, the business community drives a lot of the revenue and, tax base and everything else. It's going to be funneled to anti-program, just basically to counteract those sort of activities. And the whole, it's counterproductive in my mind, not only from just the business owner perspective and its relationship with, human rights issues downtown, but also the rest of the community, the service provider community that's fundamentally on the same charter as you. You're trying to make people's lives better, that community's lives better. It seems like the activity to that particular, what am I trying to say? Like, that's not where you want to die on the sword, in my opinion, because I think that the upside is of just, political, just, really, very much like an activist type of a motivation to do it and make a point. It's doing more damage long term than it would be short term, if that makes sense. That's my perception of it.
So I'll tell you why I think
like if I was consulting you as a brand manager, right? I would say like, let's move this down. So let's move this somewhere else. Everything you're doing is good. But if you did move it somewhere else, you might actually get to, broker a deal with the downtown business association to actually help get some funds in to do this or that. Because what happens also is after you leave on Sunday, it just becomes an aggregator, so that community kind of stays down there, and then the rest of the community feels like they've overtaken the downtown. Now nobody wants to go to the downtown, and it becomes a bigger and bigger issue, and it spills out and spills out and spills out. And then things like the needle program gets weaponized. Anytime somebody sees a pile of garbage anywhere and there's a cart nearby, that photo gets weaponized, and it just kind of becomes this negative feedback loop, if you will.
Sure. Let's talk about that weaponization.
There's a lot
of needles.
There's a lot
in a second, but yeah. So first of all, if you have a city versus a shopping mall, a city is an aggregation of citizens that have constitutional rights to be in the public space. So if you take the position that they shouldn't be in the plaza on Sunday, I guess it follows from that they should be somewhere else. Where's that somewhere else that they're supposed to be? Well, it's some other part of the public space, because that's all that population has. They live in the public space. So whether they're aggregated in the plaza, or whether they're aggregated at 1 mile, or whether they're spread out evenly 300 feet apart, they are in the fabric of the city now, because we've failed to house them. So now
they are.
Yes.
They are, because I mean these are people, and they take up a certain amount of square footage, but it's, downtown's kind of like the symbol of commerce in the community, and it's also
is it also a symbol of the Constitution? Is it a symbol of citizenship? Is it a symbol of community? Is it a symbol?
It's all those things.
Okay,
I would agree. It's all those
right.
things.
So where's commerce fit in that? That complex of elements that make up a city. Is commerce the primary purpose of a city in the downtown? Well, with my political philosophy, I wouldn't say so. I would say that commerce is something that occurs in a city as people get their material needs met within that particular market-oriented part of the city.
Well, I mean, cities are absolutely 100% about commerce. That's how they got started.
Not 100%.
That's
not in a democracy.
A
shopping mall is 100% about commerce.
But if you look at, let's go back in history and just look at how humans settled. We were spread out in plains, hunters and gatherers, but as trade routes opened up, things like that, natural choke point, natural intersections across the world kind of converged, whether it be waterways or roads. And where there was more overlap in terms of trade routes, cities naturally formed. So, I would argue that that's the foundation. Commerce was the foundation, or the, why that was happening.
It's a fundamentally important part of why cities exist. I agree with that. But Chad, what if I was to say to you, Montgomery, Alabama, 1932, having black people in the downtown area where the fancy shops are makes white people feel uncomfortable. So therefore, black people should stay out of the downtown so that we can have more commerce down there, because white people don't want to be around black people.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like it's a false equivalency, but...
How so?
I know you were going to ask me, and I'm not smart enough to answer.
Well,
I wish I was, but I'm not.
I think that any class of people, and this is where I think some thinking should happen on the part of, a lot of people in our general population, is are homeless a class of people? Do they have constitutional rights? Do they have interests just like any other class? So if we're talking about black people, or like I said, LGBTQ or women or whatever group you want to pick, is there some reason why homeless people are not a class of people? And I can't come up with a reason why they don't have interests. Or, you could take it a little further and say, do animals have, interests and moral interests? And there's people who would argue they don't have any. And then there's other people, the other end of the spectrum, who would say, oh yeah, they're sentient beings and they have all these inherent rights. And so you have animal rights people all the way over to people who have absolutely no interest in animal rights. Well, this is a philosophical issue that there's not a black or white answer to it. But as far as I can tell, homeless people are citizens every bit as much as I am. And in fact, they are more in need of our inclusion because they're suffering more than the average person is suffering. So if anything, rather than exclude them from our community, where our community meets, the central focus points of our community, rather than exclude them, I would say welcome them there, give them support there. Your perception that I can't shop down there because there's homeless people, instead of enabling that perception, I would challenge that perception, and I would say, get to know this population and then see if you feel uncomfortable down there. But for every person who says they're so uncomfortable with the homeless population in downtown that they can't shop down there, there's obviously 99 who have no such issue, because I can never find a fucking parking space down there. I mean, any business down there that has a working business model is able to function very well, make a profit. The reason that we have so many empty storefronts down there is because leases have been botched, and I won't go into all that, but it's more capitalists that are destroying downtown than the homeless, as far as I can tell. And there's some really good examples of that if you really want to go into it. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a whole nother topic around just internet technologies and disintermediation, and how it's disrupting parts of our economy.
Look into why Pete's Coffee went away. It's not because of homeless. It's because the landlord increased the rent to $6,000 a month, and Pete's didn't want to pay it.
and they split.
Yeah, and that's what's happened on all four corners there now. So that's a gutting of the downtown on a commercial basis, but it was done by one of the prime movers in the commercial sphere, not by the homeless. So,
well, I mean,
it gets blamed on
maybe this notion of it might be bad for your brand, the brand in terms of the homeless community, the homeless services community, the providers specifically. Maybe that notion that I have, or that kind of intuition that I have, maybe it's wrong. Has anyone else has like Torah Center or Jesus Center, anyone else come up to you and said like, Patrick, you gotta fucking chill out with this downtown thing, because we're getting blowback? Has anybody approached you with this?
First of all, I just want to say that it's really refreshing to be able to use the F word here. On
radio. You should listen to my.
I really appreciate it.
You should listen to my fly fishing podcast if you think this is bad.
It's one of my it's a piece of punctuation for me. So yeah.
Well, I just think it's important to have honest conversations. I try and do a podcast like I talk to my friends on the phone or in the car, or if we're over for dinner.
No, I like the quality of the conversation.
Thank you,
appreciate it. We talked about this a little bit earlier off mic. So the question of, what is the perception of what we're doing in terms of homeless advocacy in the public space on the part of the public, and how does that affect other service providers and whether they're able to be more or less effective in what they're doing? I don't get a lot of direct blowback for what we do. There seems to be more a sort of tolerance of us by other service providers rather than an embracing. So there may be some negative feeling about what we're doing, but they haven't come to me directly per se. I've gotten a few little hints here and there over the 6 years, but I've never had somebody say, hey, let's get together. I think we need to talk through whether this is really the best thing. That would be a great conversation to have, though. I wish, if they do feel that way, that they would sit down and we could hash this all out, and maybe, I might come to a different conclusion. I might convince them that they ought to come and join us.
I would honestly say that
for the latter one.
I would honestly say, though, that everybody that's been on the show, if you guys all got together and came in with the goal of being to provide better services to the homeless, being the ends justifies the means of how we get there, that I think everybody would be willing to work together.
Right.
And I mean everybody that's been on the show.
By services, do you mean charity, or do you mean human rights, justice?
I think it's both.
Well,
can you can't have one without the other, right?
You can have them both, and that's what we do on Sundays. We bring tons and tons of material, and that's charity, but we're also bringing a message of solidarity, which is a justice issue. So it's like we're bringing things for people that are necessary for them to survive, but we're also saying, hey, by being here and standing with you in this visible place, we are saying you have a human right and a civil liberty, human rights and civil liberties that support you in being in this space. So, I lost my thread there. What were you saying right before that?
Well, the ends justifying the means, and I guess I guess what my thing is, like, if everybody goes in willing to give up something, that it may not be their ideal of how they got to that end, but the means may be not exactly the thing that you had in mind. But if the goal is to get to B, then A is kind of like a negotiation. Yeah.
If service means charity, then I think you can make a really strong argument that what we're doing may be at odds with being more effective in terms of charities. In other words, I think you could make an argument that, hey, if Patrick and his group, Chico Friends on the Street and all the rest of them weren't out there on Sundays creating that, bringing all that visible poverty out there onto the streets, that public perception might be a little more positive toward the homeless, and then we might get 10% more in terms of donations every year for people who want to do X, Y, or Z in terms of charity. I think you can make that argument.
Since you
that's a high price to pay to abandon human rights.
You've brought up civil rights 3 times, and now I'll bring it up.
Sure.
That is still an ongoing thing. Even in 2019, there, African American rights and all this is still an issue. Yeah. But guess what? No one's being lynched in the streets. So there's definitely been a shit ton of progress. So it's not going to, this is not going to happen overnight. And I guess my point is like, it's more about like winning empathy from folks that are already hardened by some of the stuff that's happening downtown. You know, again, I'll just use the lady as an example, pushing the stroller. It's like doing things to soften that kind of exterior shell that she may have built up by her own, you know, her own personal.
Do you think it's unfair for me to ask the lady who's pushing the stroller with the baby to befriend the woman who's pushing the stroller with all of her worldly goods in it? You think that's a
No, I don't. Well, I definitely don't. But
right.
But
in the public space,
it's probably not realistic to, once she's had that, okay, let's just say, using the scenario where she sees the guy that's raving, right? She goes around the block, and then there's a lady pushing a stroller going the opposite direction. Mm-hmm. It's probably not realistic in that experience space, that little sphere of experience in that moment in time, to, you know, for that shell that she's built up, that hardened shell, to you know, to expect her to just slide right into another conversation or whatever without any kind of, you know, bias at that point.
Right. But isn't it true that the more that I affirm and enable her in that, what I would call irrational fear, that the deeper I dig that hole? In other words, if I challenge her, which I've done on social media several times, people who talk about all these fears. Yeah. If I challenge that fear and I say, hey, you know, like I said earlier, make 100 sandwiches, go out and distribute those sandwiches, get to know the population in the public space, and you'll find that 99% of your fears are resolved. Why not approach it that way, instead of saying, I'm going to remove what you're afraid of, even if what you're afraid of is not based on irrational fear? It seems to me that I'm supporting a culture of fear that it's like if I'm camping with a child who's 10 years old and they become hysterical every time they see a mosquito. It's like, well, I could build a whole new narrative around that fear and support them in that fear, or I could challenge that fear and say, hey, that's probably not a rational fear. Maybe we can work at getting over that. I don't know why, when it comes to the homeless population, we're so reluctant to see them as human beings that can be known and understood and befriended, because I've experienced all those things.
But when you say rational fear, and you agree fear is a subjective thing, when you say rational fear, that's kind of like your own yardstick for measuring fear.
When I say rational, I'm saying fear based on evidence, so that there's some evidence of a threat. In other words,
yeah, but
like if I say I'm afraid to walk in Bidwell Park because there's oak trees and sometimes limbs fall and kill people, right? Well, then I have to look at the data and I have to go, well, what is there an empirical? Can I support that fear empirically? And I could say, well, sure, it happens. We know it happens, but what's the probability of a oak limb falling?
Yeah, it's very rare though that somebody manifests a feeling based off of analytics. I mean, this is why we have wars, right?
Say that again.
Well, I said it's very rare that someone manifests a feeling based off of analytics.
Well, that's true, but if we're going to be a society that challenges people to think more clearly versus a culture that enables people in thinking that's, I don't know, unsupported or superstitious or whatever. I mean, that's the nature of progress. It seems to me, if we're going to have any at all, would be to have a society that's more inclined toward, you know, realism in terms of where its fears are based.
Yeah, and I think that I guess that's where I'm coming from, is just this goal of making progress, incremental progress, because this is, you know, if we use the civil rights thing again, there's a great, you know, whole case study for progress over a long period of time, right? Now, people will argue whether or not that's happening fast enough, but the point is there's progress made. There's like the quality of lives for that contingent of the population has gotten much better. Now, is it equal? No.
Well, how did it get better? I mean, how did let's just take civil rights for blacks in America. How did it get better?
Yeah,
it got better because they refused to sit at the back of the bus, right?
Yeah, so exactly.
There's the group of the population in the United States that suffers more than any other population today is the homeless population. They're the ones who die on the streets. You know, They're the ones who experience misery on a day-to-day basis. They're the ones who are, who deteriorate in terms of their mental health because they're on the streets. So there is a kind of lynching going on, but it's not literal lynching. But there are gross human rights and civil liberties violations every day on the streets. I mean, we could go into details of how that works. But so how does that group, if they're going to remain there? I mean, we talked at the beginning about housing first, and I think we're both pretty well agreed that that's not coming forward anytime soon. So this population that I'm, concerned about is going to be living in our public spaces for decades to come. How do we move forward on improving their position in terms of their human rights and civil liberties? I mean, we've had to fight for years just to get 2 portable toilets downtown, which we just got in the last few weeks. Well, that's a very simple, basic kind of human right, it seems to me, to have access to a toilet 24 hours a day. That was fought tooth and nail. And I mean, the process of just getting 2 portable toilets, which can be brought in within hours in our downtown, I don't have time to go into that saga, but it's years and years and years of agitating and advocating and pushing for that, and finally getting this very minimal response. So this population, it's not well served in terms of its, I think it's, yeah.
Yeah, and that's the fucking crazy thing about this particular subject. There's just,
why? I
don't feel like there's any answer.
Because we're in the failure zone. That's what I call it. I call going to the Plaza a meditation on death. The people who are homeless have a terminal illness. They die 20 years younger than the rest of us. They're in the public space. I don't see any solutions anytime soon. And so when I call it the failure zone, I mean, you step into this public space thing. It's like if you set up a shelter and you have people coming to you, you're kind of in the success zone because you're able to give them shelter for the night. Yeah. But if you set up a group and say, I'm going to go out into the public space, meet them there and try to meet their needs there and try to attend to their how criminalization affects them there, and then go to city council meetings and advocate for decriminalization of homelessness, et cetera, restrooms, the whole 9 yards. You stepped into this zone where it's really frustrating. It's really toxic. It's really wearing because, first of all, not many people will join you in failure. They don't like being there. They want to be. I've had people say that to me directly. Well, this doesn't solve anything. And they're absolutely right. It's simply trying to move into that zone where we've created a predicament where no good solution is at hand because the one we've already identified is off the table for what I'll argue are political reasons. So then the default is that you've got, 500,000 to 1 million people, chronically homeless on the streets of America. What's going on in that zone? It's a really ugly place to be, and it's not fun, and it doesn't feel good. And handing someone a poncho or a tarp in the Plaza on Sunday, it doesn't feel good. It feels more futile. It feels hopeless. It feels good when you sense from them that they're at least acknowledged as a human being for a minute, when most of the time people will not look at them. They're absolutely ostracized culturally, socially. So there's a kind of bridge that happens on an emotional level a little bit, but you feel like a fraud. You feel like you're a voyeur. You've gone into their lives for 2 or 3 hours here and there. You brought your boxes of stuff and you walk away and you know that they're going to die 20 years younger. That's not a good feeling.
Yeah. So everything you just described, I've heard this from people that participate in river cleanups. Right. Everything. Almost down to the T.
Yeah.
And they're related.
Yes, they are. Yeah. Yeah.
And and I've seen it firsthand, and I just don't know. You
just keep pushing. It's like Sisyphus. You keep pushing the boulder up the hill, right?
Yeah.
You clean up this stretch of the river. You got this bit of watershed, 1/8 of a mile of watershed cleaned up. You come back in 6 months and know that it's going to look just like it looked before, because we don't have a solution in place.
Right.
And so you are stepping into the failure zone.
And it's going to be Groundhog Day. And here's what's even more terrifying for me personally. And I think it was Angela McLaughlin that said this in episode 3 or something. She said that the homeless population's the canary in the coal mine.
Yes.
And this has been, that what she took, I think it was either her or Joy, but it doesn't matter. It's the canary in the coal mine analogy.
Yes.
The way that our economy is heading towards automation, we've seen this in the factories, and there's no reason to not assume that this is going to happen in kind of like the white collar workforce shortly. And this is around, basically artificial intelligence. Now, I'm not talking about a Terminator artificial intelligence, but what I'm talking about is an artificial intelligence that's very good at doing certain tasks that humans have been trained to do, traditionally, like such as accounting, right? Or
driving a truck.
Yeah. Or, a lot of the jobs that are kind of, clerical in nature, numbers in nature, typing, doing a lot of the stuff, even writing articles, right?
A lot of medicine.
All these jobs,
a lot of medicine can be done with that. Yeah.
All these jobs in roughly 10 years are going to be gone. There's going to be a huge, and I know people are probably snorting at that comment, but do some research on it, and you'll probably believe me. There's going to be a massive disruption in just our economy as we move over to figuring out what to do with these displaced workers. And we've seen this in the steel industry. We're starting to see it in the auto industry. Plants are closing, this and that. Those jobs are not coming back. They're gone. This problem, like this thing is going to actually be a backyard issue for a lot of people. And I like backyard issues is when people get mobilized, right? If it's not in your backyard, they normally don't give a shit. This is going to be a backyard issue for a lot of people. So whatever we decide to do here, best practices need to happen all over the country, because eventually this will be a federal program at some point. So the best practices laid in place, and just kind of like, I don't know if we're done with this series yet or not, but this is the thing that I'm most worried about. If I level this up to the rest of the population, the stuff that we're seeing right now is just like the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
And it's only and it's there because the folks that are in this percent of the population just don't have the tool set to not pull out of it themselves. There's brain issues. Right. There's some external force by and large that's caused them to be in the position they are, and I just call that shit luck.
For whatever reason, they're the least competitive people.
Yeah.
So the least competitive people, for a whole raft of different reasons, will be the first to lose in an economy where jobs are going away, and we have a whole bunch of problems bearing down on us right now. This fire that just happened in Paradise, it was cataclysmic. It was apocalyptic. We all felt it. It displaced,
20,000 people last I read.
Yeah,
something like that.
So
put a strain on everything down here.
So whether we're talking about artificial intelligence, automation, whether we're talking about a possible economic downturn or depression in the future, whether we're talking about some kinds of environmental issues that affect migration, there's a whole bunch of reasons to think that there might be many, many more people living in our public spaces. And I have to think that because we've done such a poor job of addressing. I mean, if we were on our game and had addressed all this over the last 30 years, we might be in a better position to take on the next million people that are on the streets. But in fact, we've done an absolutely terrible job of addressing it. So now, if the numbers grow exponentially, here's my big fear. And that is that if we don't invest ourselves in a culture of human rights and civil liberties right now, and push back against more authoritarian sentiments and more authoritarian approaches, which are all based on law and order and zero tolerance and more imprisonment and incarceration, then we've set in motion a culture. We have a basis for a future culture and a future society that goes toward authoritarianism as a solution. And when people are in crisis, they tend to go for authoritarian solutions. And so there's a deeper issue here than whether my friends on the street are experiencing, have a tarp tonight. There's another question here, and that is what is happening to the fabric of our Constitution as we begin to strip away civil liberties for that group of people. And we could talk about the laws that were passed in Chico in the last 6 years and look at those laws law by law and look at how they're not in spirit with the Constitution, not in the spirit of the Constitution. So where are we going? And so this is why I am so polarized from people at the opposite end of this discussion, because I think where they're going is really dangerous. And at their worst, when you hear what they say on social media, they're talking about rounding everybody up and taking them to the Mojave Desert and putting them inside of a chain link fence. Well, that wouldn't be the first time in history that sort of thing has happened. So I think we really need to dig in and instead of feeling, I guess, offended or pinched because we have to see homeless people in our plaza, maybe we ought to be thinking, hey, this is the moment at which history turns one way or the other in terms of how we're going to respond to these kind of crises in the future.
Yeah, I mean the Mojave Desert thing is interesting because I kind of follow everybody, and I was saying earlier, just to kind of get the zeitgeist for that community.
Yeah,
and that I would say that statement's weaponized out of I wouldn't say that that's everybody's feeling in that particular community, but just like that community would weaponize, needles that are on the ground and a picture of those needles in a group, right? Like this is part of the problem with social media. It's completely short-circuited public discourse. Like
true, but those are seeds that grow in a soil,
and
as has always happened in history, right?
Soil is Facebook.
Well, it is right now.
You know what I mean? And
but
the fertilizer is the share button.
In 1930 in Germany, it wasn't Facebook; it was another soil. And anytime we start scapegoating a group of people when we have a social problem, that needs to be challenged, because there's a kind of momentum that can happen with that, and we know this historically. So I don't think it's wild or outrageous to think that we may be looking at some of the same dynamics in the future. And that is the lens I see a lot of this through.
Yeah. I mean, fundamentally, humans are humans. We're going to do human shit, and technology is kind of a new thing. And this is part of our, I think, cognitively, our inability to deal with technology, because this is not something we're evolved to deal with on a social level.
I'd like to have the bigger discussion with you, which is really this question of what is civilization, what makes it up, how does it work, what do we see? Because I'm essentially I guess you could say I'm an anarcho-primitivist if you want to look that up. I mean, it's a school of thought that essentially says that civilization is inherently unbalanced and that there will always be these kinds of issues because the very structure of it is not very sound.
But I mean the foundation of it, in terms of my view on it is it's an agreed to system of conduct, civil conduct, whether that be defined as written laws or social mores, right?
In theory, yes, but if you look at history, you'll see that that's always redefined in the moment by whoever's defining it.
And the people that won the last war usually sets those rules for the next
generation. So in the Jim Crow South, lynching people was acceptable under your definition.
Yeah. The reason I even brought it up is I want to talk a bit about laws, especially as they relate to the homeless community. Now, we've always, and you've listened to quite a few. I think you've listened to most of the episodes, huh?
Yeah, I've listened to some. Yeah.
This notion of, there's 100,000 people. I'm not good at math, so I'm just going to say 100,000 people, and 1,000 of those people are homeless in the population, right? Now, out of those 1,000, there's 200 of them that are causing most of our quality of life crimes in Chico. You follow me so far?
Yes and no. Yeah, I know where I can hear where you're going.
So, there's a large percent of people, and this gets back to, I think some of the impetus behind putting some of the laws in place is to kind of try and manage that percent of the population. So I don't know all the laws, first of all, but I don't think that they're there to demonize the entire population. I think it's there as a control measure for the other, this 200. This 200 is again, back to the branding piece. The 200 is actually is a big problem public perception wise for folks in the homeless services space to deal with. And I think that, how do we deal with that?
Yeah.
This is a really fucking tough thing to kind of like think about in terms of all the civil rights stuff you were talking about earlier. And, do we build more jails? Do we lock them up? when you've got a group of people that are essentially lawless.
Okay, yeah, this is
how do you deal with that?
Great subject. So,
okay.
so
we got about 25 minutes if we stop right at 4, like you were saying.
Yeah, this is a great subject. So, if we think of the 4 pillars that I always talk about, you got demonization, criminalization, deprivation, and consolidation is how I look at the 4. So, one of the 4 most important elements in this is criminalization. So, what does that mean? Well, homelessness is essentially a criminal act in Chico. You cannot get through a day. When Scott Huber is on the council now, when he did his walkabout for a couple of days as a homeless person, and he and I had this conversation, and we both agreed that you cannot live as a homeless person without being a criminal. Okay, here's why. You can't sleep legally anywhere. You're breaking the law. You fall asleep, you're camping. That's how it's defined. You don't have to have any equipment. You don't have to have a campfire and marshmallows. Sleeping is illegal. Everybody sleeps. You're a criminal. If you don't have 24-hour restroom access and you urinate or defecate, that's a criminal act. If you tie a rope to a tree, that's a criminal act. If you're in certain parts of the city, like the greenways and places that you might want to try to get out of the way at night, those are all off limits. Those are criminal acts. If you're in the park after closing hours, those are criminal. That's a criminal act. If you leave a cart unattended in Chico, that's a criminal act. You cannot leave a cart and walk into a restroom without storing that cart on public property. I'm just telling you how these laws are written. I've gone over them too.
And I'm actually glad you're going over them because I don't know hardly any of them.
I've gone
I know
over
a few that you said, but not all of them.
Gone over them tooth and nail. And so, a lot of these were passed in September of 2015. It's called Protection of Public Properties Ordinance. I have it with me. You can read the whole thing, see what I'm talking about. But in that law, it says that all of these acts, having an open container. So if you're a homeless person and you ever use alcohol, you're using it in the public space. It's illegal. You've broken the law.
Well, I mean, that goes for anybody, doesn't it?
It does, but I have a place to go if I want to drink. They don't. Well, this is true of all these things. It's like I can sleep in my bed and I'm perfectly legal, right? So every single thing that I do that might be legal on my property is typically speaking not legal for them. So, in September 2015, these laws were passed, and one of the things they put into that law, this is a state-of-the-art criminalization set of laws. It was drafted by a very conservative council. It says that they can all be charged as infractions or misdemeanors. So that means that technically speaking, under our laws, if I leave a cart outside of a restroom, walk in there to use the restroom, and I come back out at the discretion of the police officer, I can be put in handcuffs and taken to county jail for that. Every single one of them, tying a rope to a tree, infraction or misdemeanor. It's all at the discretion of the police officer. So, every single homeless person in Chico is a criminal by definition. And at some point, they're going to encounter law enforcement. And at some point, typically, they're going to get a ticket for something. Possession of drug paraphernalia is another one. If I live in a house, it may be illegal to have that. But if I'm on the streets and they arrest me for tying a rope to a tree, they can search my bag and find the drug paraphernalia. So I'm vulnerable to an arrest in a way that a person with a house is not. So then, given that every single homeless person is going to encounter law enforcement at some point, and those on the opposite end of the spectrum for me call this meaningful contact, that means that they're profiled, they're rousted if they're sleeping, they're possibly ticketed, they're possibly arrested. If they get a ticket for something as simple as jaywalking, well, we've got an unstable population that has no money, has a very difficult time getting to court. So what happens next in almost every case is that they get a failure to appear, which is a misdemeanor also. That means that everybody out there on the streets has a warrant, typically a misdemeanor warrant, City of Chico. And so they're all vulnerable to arrest at any time without even having to do another such act, just because they're in violation of that warrant. Right?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that because like the other side of the spectrum is that, these laws are in place, but the DA is not doing anything about it. Therefore, the laws are not really laws.
Okay, so the only way for the DA to do more about it is to build bigger and bigger jails, because the reason the DA can't do anything about it is because all the beds are full.
He's got a physical constraint.
That's exactly right. So when the DA, he must have, I meet with him one of these days. We talked about it, but
I tried to get him on the show. The office was
Okay, I'd like to sit down. I know him a little bit, but we've never sat down and had this conversation. But so there must be conversations between Mike Ramsey and Chief O'Brien about this. Like, Mike's on the phone. Hey, Chief, quit sending us jaywalkers because right now the jail's full. So there's even if Mike Ramsey wants to take in all these cases, which I don't believe he does, because I think I've heard enough out of him to know that he doesn't really believe in criminalizing homelessness as a solution. So I think he's in sentiment in agreement with me on that. But it's a political job. So you have to, if you're going to have a street crimes unit that's trying to produce more and more arrests, and if you look at the arrest log for Chico, you'll see that 99.9% of the arrests are for things like open container, camping, failure to appear. If you're doing that job and you don't want to, get crosswise with your supervisor, you produce arrests. That's what you're out there for. You want the public to see that you're arresting people. So to bump up arrest numbers, hey, there's Joe today. He's over there. He's got a bottle open. Let's go over there and roust him and we'll take him to county jail. Okay, we got an arrest on the books. Well, Mike Ramsey doesn't want that crap down there at county jail. But he has to deal with it because in our political climate, that's seen as the way that we process the homeless population, is we run them through this treadmill. I mean, homeless people have been arrested 20, 30, 40 times. And so if a person's frustrated by that, they could say, well, gosh, they keep arresting these people and then just turning them loose. And it's like, well, what's your proposal? That we arrest them, and because they're homeless and have done no serious crime, we should contain them somewhere. Well, that's the direction that I'm opposed to going, because now poverty becomes a crime and you're incarcerating people not because they've done any serious crime, but because they are on the losing end of this economic contest, right?
I totally see where you're going with it. I just keep going back to, this is not going to happen at the state or county level. It's not. But then the question is, it's got to be a shared burden, because it's going to be a constant in our society.
But given that's true, do I capitulate to the authoritarians and say, well, it's not going to happen, so therefore zero tolerance for everything everybody does. The law applies exactly the same way to everybody, even though I have a bed to sleep in. The person who's caught camping has the same consequences I would have if I was sleeping in the park or whatever. Well, none of that makes any sense to me.
I think that
are there a few bad actors out there who actually commit serious crimes?
Absolutely.
Rape, robbery, etc. There are, and those crimes we ought to do the police work that's necessary to gather the evidence and convict those people, as with the housed population, of serious crimes when they commit serious crimes. But 99% of our emphasis is not on that. It's on using millions of dollars in police funding to chase these minor, what are called social crimes. To what end? And this is why I'm for full decriminalization of homelessness. I think we need to move in that direction, not bear down and make it even more difficult to be on the street without being a criminal. Right now, it's already impossible to not be a criminal, but we should be figuring out ways. The city of Austin just took all their criminalization laws off the books. Sit, lie, everything else. They just took it off the books because they got to the point where they realized that they're spending millions of dollars in police money and there's no benefit to it. It doesn't, all it does is, it's a waste of money. It doesn't take us anywhere. So that's why I'm so much at odds with people in the Chico First group and people who think that way, because I don't see where that leads. I don't see any sense in it.
Yeah. I mean, I think, at least part of the solution in say our county anyway, I can't speak for others, but I think my intuition tells me it's probably the case, is like, everybody's got to give up. Everybody that's got a stake in the game needs to give up something.
What should I give? What should I give up?
They got to give up a side of potatoes off the plate or something.
What's my side of potatoes from your perspective? I'm curious to hear. I'll listen.
You're not going to like it, but I mean, I think a start is like maybe do the food distribution somewhere else. Only for the reasons I already stated about just the ripple effect that has. I think in terms of just giving up is wrong. It's not giving up. It's just making a concession around that one piece. We'll probably do more way more good than what's happening right now, and it'll float everybody. It kind of give everybody lift, in my opinion.
You didn't find my arguments very compelling. It doesn't sound like.
No, I do. But
the back of the bus, all this stuff. None of it.
Well,
that as a class of people,
it's an incremental thing, though. That's my whole point about the civil rights movement. It's been an incremental thing, and it hasn't always been forward trajectory. We've gone back, but it's been
no
way,
progress.
way better,
right? But no progress was ever made without people being uncomfortable, right?
I mean,
there were people in the South who had made your argument like, just don't do that bus boycott thing. Just or don't, this thing about the back of the bus.
I wish I knew more about American history to actually
forget about it. You do it more incrementally, right? I mean, that argument's always there.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm just like looking at it with our, our very small population of 100,000 people, and it's just such a visible thing and an easy thing to weaponize, man. Like,
I know it's weaponized, but the thing is, when you're trying to do what I'm doing, there's very few places that you can go for any kind of what's the word? Political power. It's a marginalized minority point of view that gets almost zero support in the community. So if you have, let's say there's 3 or 4 ways that we can make a statement. We can be in the public space in a visible way. We can go to the council and make our case. We can write letters to the editor and make our case. We can come on a podcast with Chad and make our case. These are the ways, and there are very few others that I know of. So taking that one away when your voice is really like the 3-minute comment at the council and the 200-word, letter to the editor, and that's all you've got. Yeah. You don't have a politician who's particularly invested in your point of view. You don't have money coming to you because no one's going to support you. I mean, I have one donor right now who's done a wonderful thing in terms of helping us, but that's very rare. You don't have the numbers because you're not going to get 1,000 people. 1,000 people will watch the Super Bowl, but you're not going to get 1,000 people to come to the Plaza and stand with the poor.
One of the things that
you're asking me to give up something,
but you ticked off a bunch of things in your tool belt that you have access to. But I feel like you left one of the biggest things out, and that's diplomacy.
Well, how would that look?
I don't know how that would look. I'm just saying there's people that would probably.
It's not like I don't try.
There's probably people that would sit down and that have been on this show, sit down, and if they thought you were serious, and if they came serious also, that you guys could probably make something happen and something actually useful. Instead of like fighting over,
let's look at it in let's look at it in a cartoonish sort of way. So
I kind of do, because it is a little bit of a cartoon in my mind.
So Mark Orm's across the table from me right now, and I say, Mark, we will move our.
Who's Mark Arms? I don't know.
City manager. So
okay.
I say we will move our public feeding to a church parking lot, adjacent to the downtown. If you lead the charge on decriminalizing homelessness in Chico. Now, there's a conversation that would probably be worth having, but I mean, in the cartoon world of that actually being like a conversation that might possibly bear fruit, but I can't imagine it working that way. I would like to think that it might be able to.
Yeah.
If I was going to try to move myself over to what you're saying as I can.
But a good diplomat has faith. You gotta have faith in the process.
True. Yeah. I hear.
I hear what you're saying.
I'm not a good diplomat. That's not my strength.
If there's things to die on the sword for, and if you want to like push this, make progress, then I would keep an open mind on that.
Well, I'll certainly.
Otherwise, people are just going to dig their heels in, and there's people with a lot of money that'll just dig their heels in and make it pretty much impossible to get anything done that you want done.
But I don't think that's because we're feeding people in the plaza. I think.
Well, I think.
Are you saying that there are people
that's
who
the main thing? I'm looking at like the biggest bang to move you guys forward. That would be one thing to look at, and one big thing to look at, because it's kind of like it affects so many people, and if on both sides, and if you were to like have an honest conversation on what we could do to maybe move it or do whatever it is, whatever the mitigation strategy is, that would go a long way in terms of I think, public sentiment across the board. If that makes sense.
You might be
now.
right.
I've only been in the community for 3 years, so what the fuck do I know? But that's my opinion.
We're all learning.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a lot of ways I could go with that. I think the fact that we are there, from my perspective, instead of seeing it as blight, it ought to be seen as, wow, there's a bunch of people who are out there caring about people and no one else cares about. And it could be seen as a wonderful thing, first of all. But let's say that we just put that aside and then just look at the political dynamics and see it as a protest, which is really what it is. I haven't used that word yet. I don't know why, but that's what it is. It's been a protest.
Yeah, it is
from the beginning, 4 years ago. Why did I start that protest? Well, because the Protection of Public Properties Ordinance passed. That's why I started that protest, because I was outraged.
Is this that
it's that whole 2015 that whole raft of laws that are crafted to make homelessness illegal. So more so than it ever was. So then I said, well, what's the best thing that I could do to push back against a set of laws that makes life in the public space illegal? Would be to go into the public space and make a statement of affirming the rights of people in the public space to be there. So that's what we do in the Plaza every Sunday. Yeah. We affirm their right to be there.
I get it. I understand
if we went to your, I'm just saying this as a setup for what I'm about to say.
Yeah.
So if we did a cartoon version of reality and I said, okay, Mark, you take off all of those criminalization laws. Then I don't have a reason for my protest anymore.
Well, you can, right? Obviously, a good negotiation is to ask for everything you want, but you got to also understand that may not be your end goal, your end, right? If you can maybe get 30% taken out or 50, that's a win too, right?
No, I'd still have to protest all those laws that are unconstitutional. Still, they're on there. As long as they're there, what tool do I have to protest with? But
also, I hate to use the word constituents, but you say your stakeholders, the people you're feeding. If the ultimate outcome of that negotiation is positive in their favor, where they're given some of their civil liberties back, isn't that a good thing?
Well, it's sort of like if black people were required to sit in the back half of the bus, it's like saying, well, I will stop this bus boycott if you allow us to use the back 3/4 of the bus. Well, I'm still pretty far from having any action on my principle. But
you're closer to the front.
I'm closer to the front, but it's really hard for me in terms of principle to buy off on that kind of thinking.
Yeah, but
really
if we'll just use the seats as an analogy, for the back being at the most unoptimized spot on the bus to the front being the most optimized. I personally like the back, but moving, if we look at civil rights and the bus as the analogy for the whole movement, there's been steady progress on each row moving to the front. Now, occasionally it drops back, and I would say we're in one of those drop back moments right now, but it's still moving forward. And it hasn't happened overnight. It's a long process. Again, I get back to the backyard issue too. I think that the current state of homelessness and our lack of political will be getting more political will because of this displacement in the workforce that I've been talking about, and this canary in the coal mine thing is going to happen. And I think that I would advise patience and diplomacy, because I think it's going to happen a lot sooner than maybe you think.
What's going to happen?
Because of this backyard issue of all these workers displaced, now we have a bunch of people that are, Are you saying a socialist wealth redistribution sort of thing is going to happen? Because I don't see it happening. Well, this gets into robot taxes, and that's a whole nother thing. But basically, there's talk around, automation comes in, and a robot is a term and concept. When a lot of people think of a robot, they manifest, the George Jetson.
No, I have actually read about robot taxis.
Yeah, and I'm talking about, there's cars that are robots, and there's vacuums that are robots, but there's also automation in general as a concept.
Right.
A robot in that context could also be an algorithm that's doing your taxes.
Sure.
These things are going to displace a lot of people. So for every worker displaced and a robot, say, comes in and does their job, Do you tax that robot? Do you tax the owner of that robot because that tax base is being pulled out of the economy? These are the questions.
Right.
And so I think that our economically where we're headed is some sort of a hybrid socialist capitalist kind of a model that's really actually supported by some sort of automation tax of some sort. So and if you keep following this line of thinking, I think that there's going to naturally be some social services kinds of things that kind of crop up to facilitate it because of all these displaced workers.
I would say you're very optimistic in your thinking.
I am. I'm a technologist.
The reason, right. And the reason I
inherent.
say that is because right now we could have taxes on financial transactions, minuscule taxes that would bring in billions of dollars. We could have taxes on capital gains at a much higher rate. We could have taxes on corporate income at a much higher. We could be, in other words, the robots that you're bringing in. You're essentially saying, well, they are a benefit to the corporation and they will need less employees. Therefore, you're ultimately taxing them on profit. You can't tax them on robots if those robots aren't producing profit. So,
yeah, I mean, they will, though, because they wouldn't even be brought into the system if they weren't.
Right, but it's a novel way to gather taxes through a slightly different vehicle than we've had in the past. But the lack of political will to gather the taxes that we need today, in fact, we've gone backwards on it,
for the current problem,
in order to address wealth inequality in America, which has gotten outrageous. We should have been addressing this for the last 40 years.
I agree.
But we've slid further and further toward polarization of rich and poor. Well, what we're seeing with visible poverty, which is really what homelessness is just the one end of the bell curve, where the poorest people are sliding off the edge because we're not distributing wealth well enough to even provide them with a 200 square foot domicile and some college student to come in a couple times a week and help them with their demons. That tells me that the will to tax for the common good, that has to materialize in some form, and whether it comes in the form of robot taxes or it comes in the form of all the other millions of ways that we can tax people, the will has to be there. There has to be a political philosophy that says, for the greater good, we are going to distribute wealth differently than
I think that with the inefficiencies in how wealth is distributed today, it's bad, but it's still not bad enough to not work for most people. So the political will be there once more and more people are displaced and don't really have an option.
That's the question.
Right?
That's the question. I
firmly believe this is going to happen.
In that environment where we have a crisis of greater magnitude than the one we're seeing now.
Yes.
In other words, instead of seeing 1,000 people on the streets of Chico, we see 5,000 or 10,000.
And they're people they might be in your family.
Right. Is that going to lead to a political climate in which these
sure
kind
of
human well, I don't know about sure as 100% shit, because oftentimes collapse precipitates authoritarian responses, not the kind of humanitarian response you're talking about. Because people freeze up, they become more fearful. This is why I resist the whole idea of indulging people with their fears, because I think you have to have a culture that breaks down those fears, because those fears lead people toward more and more repressive responses, not toward more and more generous responses. And that's an unknowable. I don't know what's going to happen, but I do agree with you.
I could talk to you for another hour.
That we're probably, it'd be great. I do agree with you that in the future, we're probably looking at disruptions and economic issues that are going to very possibly drive us toward a point where this crisis is multiples of what it is today. And in that climate, I would like to have something set in motion that at least has a voice that says, hey, whatever happens, there are some fundamental human rights and civil liberties that can't be violated. And that's what I do. I mean, that's what I care about. And that's partly why.
Yeah. And I mean, this is really my whole reason, there were two reasons why I wanted to do this first season on homelessness in Chico. One, there's business ramifications, not only locally, but down the road, right?
Sure.
The other piece is, I think I told Joy in the first episode, I saw the encampments along our waterways in California, and they're near, those waterways are near and dear to my heart, and I was it made me quite angry, and that anger has been tempered as I kind of talk to folks like you and the rest of the folks that I've had on the podcast. And I also have empathy for the people that, that are affected by the quality of life crimes and things like that. I completely see both sides of it. And I've heard both arguments from my friends,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And
well,
I think
I'm a nature freak too. And I feel that same,
that's a good question. So like, what goes through your mind if you're walking on if you're walking down a trail that's otherwise pristine and then you see a cart or you see a pile of shit or whatever it is, and it just is so.
We never got to needles.
Yeah,
next time.
It's all the same. It's all pile of needles, whatever.
Pile of needles, whatever. What goes through my mind? What goes through my mind is anger, because I'm angry going back to through a whole 40-year failure.
Yeah,
to deal with our social responsibilities, and so when I look at that, I say, that's evidence of a failure in the system where we've allowed a kind of I'll just say Reaganomics to dominate our entire political culture, and that's led us to this gap between rich and poor and a failure to provide decent social services. So I get mad. I don't get mad at the person. I see the person as kind of on the receiving end of probably some kind of really shitty, hand of cards,
Do you think that when...
But it makes me sad too. But also I'll add to this just one more thing. When I look at that kind of environmental impact, I also do put that in the context of the lives of the rest of us who are the functional citizens. And given that I think rampant consumerism is what's taken down the planet, then I really feel like the people who do the most damage to our environment, and I've said this in many letters, et cetera, are not the homeless. They create visible stuff, but the rest of us, I shit.
I totally agree.
White liberal that flies to Europe, that person had 20 times the impact as any homeless person has in a year of their life.
100% agree with you. That's a numbers thing. That's undeniable.
It's visible, acceptable damage versus unacceptable damage, and it's ironic that it's proportional.
Do you think that when you see these encampments that are clearly abandoned in say, one of the creeks that doesn't run year round, like one of the creek beds, and there's an encampment there, and literally everything's just left and they walk off. Mm-hmm. Is that like their own form of protest also? Where they just, they'll leave garbage in certain areas. It's like really
it's compound
in the public.
Yeah, it's compound because you have, I think there's to some extent a kind of warfare that's going on between the community and the homeless, and I think that creates resentment. Yeah. So I think there might be a little bit of a fuck you in that. But I also think that if you're talking about a person who's had cigarettes put out on their arm when they were 2 years old, dumped into 20 or 30 foster homes, and this literally happens, maybe has a brain injury, maybe is now addicted to heroin, now is living where they're exposed to the elements every day and they don't sleep. When I look at that possible profile in terms of a human being and their experience, and I say, wow, they left an encampment, it's not hard for me to imagine that they might not have had it together well enough to go, well, I think I'll clean this all up before I leave. They're just moving on to the next survival.
And the issue. Ones that I guess I was wondering about are more the I would say lucid, like these things are like, for example, when I was prepping for these interviews, right, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. So I got on Reddit, and Reddit's like, Reddit's a thing that it's powerful, but it can also be kind of a time suck. But Reddit's got a subreddit called Homelessness, right? And a lot of the community there it's either service providers, it's people doing research on the problem, or it's actual homeless folks. Yeah. And so I asked, to get prepped for the first interview specifically, I asked, hey, I kind of like framed what I was doing, said, do you guys have any questions? One thing I noticed is I just kind of like got into the innards of the threaded conversations, and this was by far not the only thing that was being talked about, but there was a contingent of people that I would consider professional homeless, that they were actually trading notes on what services and what communities offered what, and why, pros and cons of using one or the other. And I thought that was really interesting, because it was almost like they were making a career out of it or something. And in this class of homeless,
but it's still an adaptation to extreme poverty. It's like if they had some better way of living, I would imagine they would choose that, right?
Yeah, and I think
that's
that,
but let me just say, I'm not saying that everyone in the homeless population is, a stellar human being that,
not everyone on my block is either.
Right. Exactly. That's what I was saying. It's like they're a mixed bag, like every other mixed bag of human beings.
Yeah.
And there's, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I would say that there's probably a higher number of people in that population who, because of their life experience, are, I don't know what the word is. Maybe there's a larger number of sociopaths in that population because, you're talking about an element of people who have really typically been brutalized in ways that most of us can't even comprehend. Yeah. So that's going to have an impact on people's attitudes, on their psychological makeup, et cetera, et cetera.
And I could see, but
here I come back to this one thing. I could see
how that choices of a lifestyle would actually would attract someone that's a sociopath, because they don't work within the same confines that we do in terms of social mores and all that we
right,
talked
but you
earlier.
Could argue that used car sales attract sociopaths or whatever. There's a book called
CEOs.
A book called the There's a book called The Sociopath Next Door.
I gotta get
talks
that.
about this issue. So they're everywhere, but the thing is, I come back to the same thing, and that is, we have to do the job first before we can start pointing fingers at them. It's like if the solution isn't available, then it doesn't make sense to, essentially.
There's always somebody that's going to count cards.
Blame the victim or whatever, right?
There's always a certain amount of the population that's going to count cards in a casino, right? And most people are just trying to win their money by sheer luck, but there's always somebody that's trying to count the cards, and that's, you can apply that to any population. So there's always bad apples.
It's like the thing of the welfare scammer. It's like that same kind of argument, which was used heavily in the 60s and 70s and 80s when people tried to essentially, gut the war on poverty. It's like, well, the welfare queen story. She's driving a Cadillac, blah 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 blah, and she's working the system, and
12 kids, blah blah blah.
Right. There's, I'm not saying that never happened, but it's a device, and so I'm careful with, when people are living in extreme poverty, leaning too heavily on the argument that, there's a whole bunch of scammers out there. Ultimately, if someone commits a serious crime, and we, however you want to define that, it's not falling asleep though, then we ought to go after that kind of crime and stop wasting money on the rest of it. And if someone is scamming the system in an illegal way, then we ought to go after that. And so I have no, there's people who say, oh, that Patrick, he just believes in anarchy and he just doesn't believe that any laws. I definitely believe in the law.
I don't get a sense of that you're an anarchist in this particular podcast. I don't know much about you though, other than this podcast. So I don't know, what historically.
It'll have to be another podcast.
Yeah. But, I'm encouraged that, I think it would be a good idea to just sit down with everybody that's been on the show and try and maybe work out some sort of a deal. I don't know what that deal is.
That would be an interesting conversation.
It's worth trying though, it's like there's been zero progress made, in my opinion, in 3 years that I've been here and just listening.
Well, I'm not even on board with a lot of the service providers in certain ways. Yeah. We haven't even gone into the whole question of consolidation, the whole consolidation of services, the removal of the Jesus Center from the downtown. I'm opposed to that. So that puts me at odds with that whole, there's a group of people, the city, DCBA, downtown, and service providers that are, interested in doing
when
that.
You talk about consolidation, me being in technology, the first thing I think of, like a shared database. What are you talking about?
I'm talking about a geographic consolidation. So that means that all homeless services are going to be put over in the ideal, from their point of view.
Okay.
Put in that area over on Martin Luther King Drive, where next to Costco there, in that 4-acre, next to Torres.
But if I'm homeless, it would be this is the reason malls were made, right? It's just like everything's in one spot, and I can just pop around and go.
That's an argument for it. The argument against it is that this is a whole subject.
Okay.
This is a whole subject. Because when you talk about consolidating people, and
it's 4:12, just to time check.
I gotta go. Sorry, man.
Well, okay. Can you finish the thought really quick?
Sure. So, when you talk about consolidating services, you have to ask the question: are the people who are being consolidated, are they being criminalized? Are they deprived? If they're being criminalized and deprived, they don't have a free choice of whether to go there, because life on the outside of that facility is unlivable.
Yeah,
and this we can do if we want to do it that way. When you do that, you've now essentially de facto incarcerated people for poverty. This is a very bad thing to do, and that's the direction that our city has been going, if we really want to dig into it. So my thing is with all systems, like an ecological system or any system, the more diversity you have, the more geographic distribution you have, the healthier that system is. The more you concentrate something in one spot and make it monopolize services and reduce choice about whether to be in that facility, then you've made that facility more and more like a prison, and you've limited their incentive to make it a good place to be. So if somebody wants to set up something like that, and the people on the streets have their physical needs met, in other words, they've got toilets and they've got a raincoat, and they're not being criminalized every day and sent to county jail, and they decide to go there, I have no objection to that. But in order for that to happen, you have to have geographically distributed services, because otherwise
I see what you're
put everything in one
like
spot.
Satellite services, but not
right.
Okay.
Right. So that's why people went crazy when the Orange Street Shelter was proposed, because the Orange Street Shelter was outside of this model.
Okay.
So it's a geographically non-conforming facility, because it's very geographic, and it's fundamentally geographic. So you put Orange Street Shelter over there by the train station or whatever. Now you've got, that's why, Sean Morgan's top of his head's coming off at the city council meeting. I mean, I was there. People are very attached to this idea that we can concentrate services, remove all support, criminalize. This is on that end of the spectrum. And this is what Robert, what's his name, came into, I can't even think of his name. Robert Marbut came as a consultant to push this whole idea. The benefit to it is that now people who don't want to see homeless people in any other part of the city landscape, they get their goal met. So the more effective that model is, the less likely you are to see a homeless person in the plaza or anywhere else, because you've made it so that it's impossible to live anywhere else.
Yeah, I got it.
So there's a whole bunch of civil liberties ramifications and human rights issues embedded in that discussion.
But if I look at it just from a pure utilitarian standpoint in terms of operational efficiencies, right? If I've got a lattice work of services that I'm trying to coordinate, and a population that needs those services, and they're by nature transient, if they're in an area, I'm more effective at providing that service and getting wringing as much value out of the dollar that it takes to put that infrastructure in place.
But we have to be really careful about letting efficiency be the guiding principle versus whether or not that person has their rights intact.
Yeah, because it's a great point. I get what you're saying. I'm just I'm looking at it just purely from an operations perspective.
There's arguments. There's definitely arguments
for doing it, but I also understand what you're saying. Yeah. You don't want it to be a fucking maximum security prison either.
And the only way that it's not that is that you have a culture and you have the political will to make it something other than that. And right now we don't have that.
Well, maybe let's wrap it up, and I'll say, and we'll end with, well, maybe everybody that's been on this podcast get together in the Bat Cave or wherever you guys want to meet at Round Table or whatever, and fucking put something together. Because as long as if you guys can do it as a team, and then sell it to your constituents, because that's what it's going to take. It is going to be a bit of a sales process also.
If there's
I think you can move the needle. You can move the ball forward.
Imagine your way to the group of people that you've interviewed so far agreeing on one thing. Tell me what that is, and I'll sit down and try to hammer it out.
Well, I would hope it would be the end goal being to help these folks out.
Well, we could probably all say that. But when it comes to the specifics of how you do that, we're very far apart.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys can't do it, then maybe new leadership needs to be put in those spots, because somebody.
Oh, I wish someone would take over my job.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying. I mean, if you guys can't come to a thing, then maybe the constituents need to get people in place that can. I know that sounds like a dick thing to say.
No, it's fine.
You know what I mean?
This is not that much fun for me. So if somebody else can come along,
I'm sure,
and make the homeless human rights case in some way that leads to some nirvana kumbaya utopian future. By God, step in, because I'm fucking tired of this.
Yeah, like
I try to get out of it once in a while, and it's like a tar baby.
But I'm glad you're in the mix, man, because at least you keep everything,
all fucked up.
No, I mean it's all part of the process, man, and we got to figure this out. Because my biggest worry is down the road when the automation starts to displace workers. That's where
I think your fear is. I think your fear is.
And I'm all about case studies, and if we can figure out a way to deal some solution for homelessness, then that can be replicated and applied at a much bigger level and scaled up. That solution can be scaled up, because we're going to have to scale it up eventually.
I think your fears are warranted, and I think where we are politically today, our orientation, how our moral compass is pointing, is going to have a lot to do with how it all comes out. And I'm 63 years old. I don't necessarily think I'm going to be around to see a lot of this, but I do think the groundwork that's being laid right now is really important. And I'm not very fucking optimistic about any of it, because I don't like what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I am.
Well, good. Well, we can have that battle too sometime.
Thank you for coming on.
I appreciate you having me on. This is a great conversation, and and I really enjoy it. So thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening. If you guys like this episode, please leave us a review on iTunes or Google Play or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you think this conversation has added value, please tell your friends about it. This is a community-based problem with a community-based set of solutions. Leave it at that.
Take care, Chad.
Thank you.
This podcast has been brought to you by AMP.build, a software and digital design agency located in Chico, California. Learn more at www.amp.build. If you have ideas or questions for the show, send an email to hello@amp.build. We may air it on the next show.